Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the entire congregation, I welcome you to the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Shenandoah Valley. I am Abby Darkangelis, your worship associate for today's service. We gather together with our doubts as well as our convictions, with our fears and our hopes, with our failures and our aspirations, with our sorrows and our joys. Whether you are joining us today for the first time or you've been a member or friend for many years, we are glad you are here. Whatever faiths you have known, if any, whatever your background, whoever you are, whomever you love, however you arrived here, you are welcome. Our speaker today is George Bowerman, who will talk about lying fallow and the beauty of loss. George is our current UUCSV artist in residence and recent graduate from John O'Connor's piano studio with a Master of Music in Piano Performance. He is a concert artist, private teacher, and newly hired adjunct teaching fellow at Shenandoah Conservatory. Originally from Springfield, Massachusetts, George's studies have taken him to Dickinson College, Toronto, Philadelphia, and finally Winchester, where he has resided since 2016. His piano happily makes its home in our UUCSV sanctuary.
Bannacht by John O'Donohue. On the day when the weight deadens on your shoulders and you stumble, may the clay dance to balance you. And when your eyes freeze behind the gray window and the ghost of lost gets into you, may a flock of colors, indigo, red, green, and azure blue, come to awaken in you a meadow of delight. When the canvas frays and the currach of thought and a stain of ocean blackens beneath you, may there come across the waters a path of yellow moonlight to bring you safely home. May the nourishment of the earth be yours. May the clarity of light be yours. May the fluency of the ocean be yours. May the protection of the ancestors be yours. And so may a slow wind work these words of love around you, an invisible cloak to mind your life.
Now, as Phil comes forward, let us all say together from our homes the words for lighting our chalice. In the light of the truth and in the warmth of love, we gather to seek, to sustain, to share. And I invite you to join with me as we say our covenant. Love is the spirit of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament. To dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in freedom, and to help our neighbor. To these ends we covenant, one with another. Please join me in a moment of silence as we hold in our hearts all those in our nation and the world who are struggling and suffering from the COVID-19 pandemic and systemic racial injustice and all the challenges they must face.
Time for All Ages is an excerpt from The Little Prince. I had thus learned a second fact of great importance. This was that the planet the little prince came from was scarcely any larger than a house. But that did not really surprise me much. I knew very well that in addition to the great planets, such as Earth, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, to which we have given names, there are also hundreds of others, some of which are so small that one has a hard time seeing them through the telescope. When an astronomer discovers one of these, he does not give it a name, but only a number. He might call it, for example, Asteroid 325. I have serious reason to believe that the planet from which the little prince came from is the asteroid known as B612. This asteroid has only once been seen through the telescope. That was by a Turkish astronomer in 1909. On making his discovery, the astronomer had presented it to the International Astronomical Congress in a great demonstration. But he was in Turkish costume, and so nobody would believe what he said. Grown-ups are like that. Fortunately, however, for the reputation of asteroid B612, a Turkish dictator made a law that his subjects, under pain of death, should change to European costume. So in 1920, the astronomer gave his demonstration all over again, dressed with impressive style and elegance, and this time, everybody accepted his report. If I have told you these details about the asteroid, and made a note of its number for you, it is on account of the grown-ups and their ways. Grown-ups love figures. When you tell them that you have made a new friend, they never ask you any questions about essential matters. They never say to you, "What does his voice sound like? What games does he love best? Does he collect butterflies?" Instead, they demand, "How old is he? How many brothers has he? How much does he weigh? How much money does his father make?" Only from these figures do they think they have learned anything about him. If you were to say to grown-ups, "I saw a beautiful house made of rosy brick with geraniums in the windows and doves on the roof," they would not be able to get any idea of that house at all. You would have to say to them, "I saw a house that cost $20,000. Then they would exclaim, "Oh, what a pretty house that is." Just so you might say to them, "The proof that the little prince existed is that he was charming, that he laughed, and that he was looking for a sheep. If anybody wants a sheep, that is proof that he exists." And what good would it do to tell them that? They would shrug their shoulders and treat you like a child. But if you said to them, "The planet he came from is asteroid B612, then they would be convinced and leave you in peace from their questions. They are like that. One must not hold it against them. Children should always show great forbearance towards grown-up people. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you to the Unitarian Church here for having me as a guest. It's a great honor to be invited to do a service here. I'll open with an Aesop fable, The Ants and the Grasshopper. One bright day in late autumn, a family of ants were bustling about in the warm sunshine, drying out the grain they had stored up during the summer, when a starving grasshopper, his fiddle under his arm, came up and humbly begged for a bite to eat. "What?" cried the ants in surprise. "Haven't you stored anything away from the winter? What in the world were you doing all last summer?" "I didn't have time to store up any food," whined the grasshopper. "I was so busy making music that before I knew it, the summer was gone." The ants shrugged their shoulders in disgust. "Making music, were you?" they cried. "Very well, now dance." And they turned their backs on the grasshopper and went on with their work. Ever since my second and final graduate recital last October, completing the playing portion of my master's degree, it's been hard to find my way back to the piano in any serious, consistent way. Yes, it was just a recital at the end of one cycle of learning repertoire, having lessons, and playing in as many places as possible before the big event. And with this particular recital, I did that more intensively than ever before. But really, this recital marked the end of a 12 or 14-year process for me. At age 16, I told my parents that I thought becoming a concert pianist was what my life was to be about. At 18, I chose Dickinson College for my undergraduate studies, specifically because a particular teacher had been recommended to me, and it was a place I could receive much needed close attention because I was somewhat behind based on my musical aspirations. As I neared graduation and feeling I wasn't yet ready for graduate school in piano performance to the level I wanted to be, I decided to craft something away from school for a while, ultimately through a series of serendipitous connections, moving to Toronto at age 22 and embarking on a solitary sojourn more deeply into my musical self than I ever could have imagined. My plan to stay in Toronto for 2 years turned into 3.5, with my last year there coinciding perfectly with John O'Connor's arrival, having taken on a significant post at Toronto's Glen Gould School. Thanks to a friend I met up there, I began taking lessons with John at age 25. And a few months in, he said, "You know, I could see you more often were you to come study with me privately in Winchester, Virginia." Where's that, I thought, as I began to already make plans to move here. And so at 26, I began my move to Winchester, solely on the recommendation of my teacher, settling here permanently in fall of 2016, thinking I'd continue my private studies and maybe around age 30, I'd consider returning to school. A few months into my time here, however, John turned to me during a lesson and said, "You know, if you're living here and studying with me, you might as well do the master's." And so I auditioned in winter of 2017, got accepted, and started the program that fall at age 27. 3 long years later, I finally got my master's at age 30, and a teacher who said to me, "Your graduate recital was thoroughly a professional one. When I took you on as a student, I never thought you'd be playing at this level," which is a very John compliment, but he meant it positively. I had made it. This long and winding path had reached its end, this long pursuit to arrive at a teacher and program at the level of someone like John O'Connor. Now what? And so, between graduating and the pandemic, taking time away from the piano, the grasshopper and ants in me have been warring. "Respect this fallow time, this time of regeneration. You are completely spent," the grasshopper says. "You lazy failure," the ants reply. "You won't have any grain to eat when the time comes. You're useless." There was this wonderful New York Times article that I came across a little while back titled, "You are doing something important when you aren't doing anything," an opinion piece written by a novelist on the importance of lying fallow. She writes, "Protecting and practicing fallow time is an act of resistance. It can make us feel out of step with what the prevailing culture tells us, the 24/7 hamster wheel of work, the constant accessibility, and the impatient press of social media all hasten the anxiety over someone else's judgment. If you aren't visibly producing, you aren't worthy. In this context, taking time to lie dormant feels greedy, even wasteful," unquote. The ants in me are like a mighty force of puritanical capitalists. "You're only as worthy as the amount of work you accomplish," they say. And it's scary letting things go to seed. Will your crop regenerate? What comes up again from the soil will be similar, but inherently changed and new by having gone through another season of growth. When I'm in times like this, as of course these cycles in us are cyclical, I always return to the image of the snake and what they go through as they shed their skin. Not only do they have to rub themselves against a jagged object, they also become temporarily blind in the process. It is the most vulnerable time imaginable for them. And so that's who I come to you as today, a snake with half its skin off, wondering what I'll emerge as, what colors my new coat will have, wondering where this process will lead, and when I'll be able to see again. As I mentioned, ever since my recital last October, and especially since graduating in May, I've hardly touched the piano. And so, as my service approached, I dreaded it more and more. My grasshopperness would be revealed. The ants said, "What will people think? You have nothing to play. Who are you with nothing to play?" I will have to come to them honestly, I thought. In a symbolically beautiful way, and it's why we have moved the upright piano into the sanctuary here. Even my piano is undergoing change, receiving some much needed work to the action, and thus the case sits here entirely empty, a shell of itself. And so for my musical message portion of this, in my time of lying fallow, I decided to feature a piece from my October graduate recital, Chopin's Polonaise Fantasy. But I'd also like to share a story about one of the most significant periods of my life, growing as a pianist and human being, and why this piece is so important to me. It may take a little while to get there, but I swear I'll come back around to Chopin. When I selected Dickinson specifically for the teacher I would study with, I was also excited that it was a liberal arts college. I wanted a well-rounded education as I have a diverse array of academic interest. However, during my sophomore year, it was becoming clear that I did not have enough time to practice. Biology lab, philosophy papers, important for my learning, but took me away from putting in the hours at the keyboard. And so I began making plans for my junior year, during which most students at Dickinson leave campus to study abroad. What could my study abroad be? I ultimately decided to take a leave of absence to study with a master teacher in Philadelphia, a man by the name of Samuel Shue. I would have 8 months to study with him, June through January, before returning to Dickinson. I would never be the same after. Now, I'd love to tell you the completely magical story of how I came to know Dr. Shue, who composed the prelude you just heard, and how studying with him particularly came to be, but that is beyond the scope of this message. My journey to Philadelphia and Dr. Shue began in June 2010. One of my mom's best friends from graduate school, who lived in the historic Italian market section of Philadelphia, agreed to host me for the duration of my studies. And on my first day there, my mom, my host Mary, and I met Dr. Shue for lunch, during which Dr. Shue wanted to make sure he had their blessing to teach me and take me under his wing. That was just Dr. Shue's way: humble, kind, caring. Mary got me permission at the University of the Arts in Center City to practice in the music building, as she was a professor of bookmaking there, which is where I'd soon spend 6, 7, 8 hours a day practicing, looking out onto the city from the 12th and 13th story during my breaks. It was my first time in a major city, and the energy fueled me. For my lessons, however, I'd travel on the train out to the country, an hour-long trek outside the city to Langhorne, PA, where Dr. Shue taught at the Philadelphia Biblical University. Dr. Shue was an evangelical Christian, but that really doesn't capture the depth of just how deeply spiritual he was. Truly, if being enlightened in this human life is possible, he was pretty darn close to it. Dr. Shue also lived in Center City, so we'd time it to be on the same train. He'd often greet me with a coffee and donut as I got on the train, and really our lesson had already begun. He'd talk to me about the Bible, about philosophy, about famous pianists. He'd roll his fingers and hand on the seat back in front of us, showing me how to properly use my hand at the piano, how to practice, how to keep my fingers strong. We were having 2-3 lessons a week, and the lessons would last all day, punctuated by trips to the vending machine for a little snack of chips, and always a cup of green tea in his office. I will forever love oolong because of this era in my life. When he wanted to teach me something at the piano to get a point across, he'd pull a book of poetry from his teeming bookshelves, or he'd play a different piece by a completely different composer to get a certain sound in my ear. He sat far away from the piano, looking at a score, and after I played, there'd be this long, pregnant silence. Anyone who worked with Dr. Shue knew this to be the beautiful, yet entirely frustrating mystery of Dr. Shue's masterful teaching. I had never had lessons like this. After a long day together, and after his teaching and classes were done once the summer was over and the semester had started, we'd travel back together on the train, often getting off at a different stop than in the morning, and going to the Imperial Inn, a Chinese restaurant that he frequented for years. "A seafood soup and tea," he'd say as we walked in, the only times I ever heard him speak Chinese, and according to him, the only Chinese he remembered. Dr. Shue was originally from Shanghai and had been recognized as a prodigy there. He came to America in his youth, actually to attend the Philadelphia Biblical School himself as a teen. His teacher at the time wanted to send him to Curtis to prepare him for a significant career as a concertizing pianist. But he just felt like his life was about something else than that. Music, yes, a deep, deep relationship with music, but also teaching and studying. After graduation, he studied with one of the most significant German musicologists of the 20th century, Karl Geiringer, and then pianistically became the last full-time pupil of Madame Rosina Levine, who knew Rachmaninoff, and was the teacher of Van Cliburn, among others. After she stopped teaching full-time due to her age, she still saw Dr. Shue on a weekly and bi-weekly basis. He traveled to Juilliard in her New York City apartment on the train from Philadelphia, and every other lesson focused on a different work by Chopin. During my studies with Dr. Shue, my transformation was intense. Talk about being a snake. I was in a constant state of shedding skin, becoming blind, being born anew, shedding skin, becoming blind, born anew. One door after the next was traversed rapidly. He'd say things to me like, "I'm just your guide. Everything you need is already within yourself. I am just helping you bring it out. It really was a process of being birthed. Verbatim, one time he said to me, I know I can't make you a born-again Christian, but I am making you a born-again pianist. And it was true. He set the foundation for my entire musical life to follow. But deeper than that, my emotional landscape, my awareness of things, my experience of just being human. He could be a person of both many words, and as his background in theology, philosophy, and musicology was vast, but also sometimes of only a few. Desperate for some magic solution, some secret revealed by someone more experienced than I'd ask him before a performance, what should I do? How should I prepare? I'm so nervous. And he'd reply, just be yourself, with that wry smile that became so familiar. And he meant it not to be avoidant to the plea, but with such a deep level of love and reverence for my own musical voice. This experience, this richness went on constantly for those short months that felt like entire lifetimes. My parents loved him. He came to visit during Thanksgiving of 2010, and we put on a house concert together of solo works and duets. My father is a visual artist, and Dr. Shu sat for his portrait. Dr. Shu was charged with preparing me for my junior recital to be presented upon my return to school after my leave of absence. This was my first of 2 degree recitals. One day he put a piece of music in front of me and said, play through this for me. Now my sight reading isn't that great to begin with, and this piece was impossible. Turns out it had never been played before and had just been written for him by an aging composer from New York, Raoul Plesko, a German-born Jewish man displaced by the Nazis, and who was a significant modern composer of the upper New York school lineage. Dr. Shu was so excited by my playing of this, he called the composer right there and said, I'd like your permission to give this piece to George as a world premiere. He just played through it beautifully. Thus unfolded a whole other part of this story I don't have time for, of trips to New York to meet Mr. Plesko, interviews, hundreds of hours beating my head against the wall to learn an idiom I was completely unprepared for. But ultimately it ended up with my performing a world premiere on my junior recital, with the composer, Mr. Plesko, in attendance, and a pre-concert lecture by the composer, moderated by Dr. Shu. In his own words, Dr. Shu said, as an artist, you have a responsibility to give voice to these works. After my junior recital, Dr. Shu returned to Philadelphia and I to my routine at Dickinson. But come Thanksgiving 2011, Dr. Shu again came to visit. He got to see his portrait as it had developed so far. We celebrated over many meals, wine, music. I had to leave for a train very early on Sunday morning. So on Saturday evening, I said goodnight to Dr. Shu and kissed him goodbye and thanked him for coming to visit again. We'd be in touch, he said. Sunday morning he spent with my parents, and they continued to revel together in our mutual love and appreciation for one another. Verbatim, my dad remembers him saying that morning, I've never had a student like George before. He really cares about me. He even helps me across the street. As an aside, Dr. Shu had pretty terrible eyesight, a degenerative condition of some kind. I remember how he'd have his assistant blow up photocopies of his music to be gigantic sizes. Anyways, that morning, they packed him a lunch, put him on the train, and sent him on his way. Back at Dickinson that week on a normal day, I came out of a piano lesson with my teacher and had a voicemail from Erickson. Erickson was a Cuban-born prodigy pianist who had also been a long-time student of Dr. Shu, and who, during my time in Philadelphia, became like a brother to me. He was the reason I met Dr. Shu to begin with. To this day, he is one of my closest friends. This message stopped me in my tracks. The world around me stopped. There had been a terrible accident. Dr. Shu was in the hospital, and I should call right away if I wanted to say goodbye. I called Erickson in a panic, and sniffling, he says I should say some things to Dr. Shu now. How does anyone prepare for a moment like this? I had been with him 4 days ago. I literally sprinted to my friend's house and got to the train station 30 minutes away, getting on the next available train. I remember crying the entire way. I got to the hospital in downtown Philadelphia and collapsed into the arms of one of his students. I'd never seen someone sick in the hospital. That morning, Dr. Shu, on his way to the train station to head up to school to teach, had gone to cross the street and was struck by a vehicle. We'd later find out the driver was on a phone. He went into emergency brain surgery, which lasted several hours. Bandaged in the ICU, his body was pumping with the machine. It was truly horrifying. My world had changed in the span of a 2-minute phone call. That night, Erickson and I stayed and stayed as people came and went, saying goodbye. It became clear that we weren't leaving, and soon around 2 a.m., things became very quiet. We'd oscillate between sitting by his side and taking a break in a room they had set up for us with food and water and seats. See, Dr. Shu had many students who loved him dearly, but only a few children. Erickson and I were lucky enough to be considered children of his. We held his hand on each side, read psalms to him. It was devastating, but the space around us was changing. I can't really explain it, but in those early morning hours, the magic of his presence was palpable. Erickson and I would go outside to take breaks, and at one point, remember, we're in Center City, Philadelphia. We saw this incredible star twinkling so brightly. Erickson still had hope Dr. Shu might come out of this, but I knew this was goodbye. In one of the most inexplicable happenings of the evening, we decided we wanted to play music for him over Erickson's phone. At the time, all Erickson had was Pandora, which, if any of you remember, doesn't allow you to play specific selections or pieces, but rather provides a station of a particular artist or composer. Naturally, we decided on Bach, one of Dr. Schu's favorites, and then Chopin. I kid you not, we said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could play the Polonaise Fantasy for him, since this was a piece that Dr. Schu loved and played beautifully, and was one of the first pieces I heard him perform. And the very first piece to be played by this random computer algorithm was none other than the Polonaise Fantasy. We thought, okay, Dr. Schu, you trickster. We could smile and breathe again. As the hours wore on, the nurses started to come in to do the compulsory responsivity tests. Since he underwent surgery and had so many drugs coursing through him, a series of these tests must be done after the drugs have worn off. Only then can they pronounce someone brain dead. It was hard to see them handle him like he was just a slab of meat and bone. There was something so impersonal about it, sterile. We decided we just couldn't be there any longer after 12 intense sleepless hours. How do you say goodbye in that moment? I honestly can't even remember that part of the experience when we decided to leave. But as we were walking out of the hospital, I felt impelled to go back to him. I was suddenly struck with this feeling. I returned to his side, and looking out the window of his hospital room, it was truly one of the most brilliant, spectacular days you could have. The sun was shining brightly, cascading off of the many buildings of Center City. I thought, the world just keeps turning. The sun rises, the days go on. To my left, one world is ending, and to my right, another is radiant and eternal. Would you believe, and I didn't learn this until his brother told me at the funeral, that Samuel Schu's Chinese name translates to one who builds up the light. I understood something in that moment that forever changed me, more than any lesson in his office or any amount of hours at the piano. Here was this beautiful man shedding his skin, becoming anew. I turned to him and I said in his ear, "Thank you. I understand now. Thank you for this last lesson you gave Erickson and I." I kissed his cheek and stepped out into the sun. I'll end with On Work from The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. And what is it to work with love? It is to weave the cloth with threads drawn from your heart, even as if your beloved were to wear that cloth. It is to build a house with affection, even as if your beloved were to dwell in that house. It is to sow seeds with tenderness, and reap the harvest with joy, even as if your beloved were to eat the fruit. It is to charge all things you fashion with a breath of your own spirit, and to know that all the blessed dead are standing about you and watching. Thank you.
As Phil extinguishes the flame, let us say together from our homes the words for extinguishing our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of our community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we meet again.
I close today with a poem by Wendell Berry titled The Peace of Wild Things. And I must give a little plug to Nancy Tickner, who found this as maybe being appropriate for the theme of my message today. So thank you, Nancy. The Peace of Wild Things. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. And today's closing music will be Dr. Shu himself playing Debussy's Clair de Lune. I hope you enjoy.
The purpose of the church is to encourage all who gather to grow more generous in spirit and in action. We hope you will consider making an offering after today's service through our webpage, uushenandoah.org, which allows us to exercise that generosity of spirit for the self-supporting church and its many ministries which continue while we are not able to be physically together. We invite you to join our church community at noon at our virtual post-service gathering for joys and concerns, followed by our coffee hour conversations in smaller breakout groups. The Zoom link is found in your UUCSB email. Thank you for joining us today.